Good morning, everyone. Hope you are well. We're going to be studying together Parashat Toldot, which, if you do have a chumash, perhaps could be beneficial. The learning today, the shiur today, is sponsored by Morty and Pat Gelber. It's to commemorate the yard site of Morty's mother, Sarah Bat Yaakov. The actual yard site is Wednesday, the 2nd of Kislev. So thank you, Pat, and thank you, Morty, for the sponsorship. The Neshama should have an aliyah from the words of Torah that we're going to be studying here today. So Parashat Toldot, the first verse itself relates to an idea or addresses an issue that we've talked about in the past. So we'll read the first verse and then have a brief reminder of what we analyzed and what the commentators say regarding this verse and the issue. Well, this is a parsha that wants to introduce the descendants of Yitzchak, his children, Esav and Yaakov. And therefore, it starts off with this introduction. Ve'ele toldot Yitzchak ben Avraham. You know what you're going to be studying here in this portion? The toldot. You're going to go ahead and study about the life of the children of Yitzchak and of Rivka. And then, after identifying them as the children of Yitzchak ben Avraham, the Torah feels a need to inform us, Avraham holid et Yitzchak, that you should know it is Avraham who gave birth, or who was the father for Yitzchak. Information that on the surface is not really needed. We've been told that it is Yitzchak ben Avraham in this verse. So what is being added here? So the Midrash shares with us that if you do remember from 2 weeks ago, Sarah only conceived after a very unfortunate incident when she was taken by Avimelech, the Philistines, the king of the Philistines. And therefore, obviously, the late night shows who need to entertain, who have to be funny, and at the same time, they want to get new jokes from current events. So the late night shows of that era were claiming that it is not possible that Avraham is the father, because Sarah spent all those years together with Avraham and did not give birth. And now suddenly she spends perhaps one night in the castle of Avimelech, and the next thing we know, she's expecting. So therefore, the rumors were circulating by these late sanim, by these clowns, that Me'avimelech nitabra Sarah, that he is the real father. So therefore, the Torah has to inform us, no, that's not the case. Avraham holidat Yitzchak. Now, this information would perhaps just be sharing with us something that related to the world that existed 3,400 years ago. However, we know that anything that's mentioned in the Torah must be relevant for the future as well. And often it is there to indicate and to address an attitude that's going to exist in the future. Maaseh Avot Siman Lebanim. And therefore, notes the Sforno the following, that right after the birth of Yitzchak, Ishmael is sent off, because as the Torah expresses the negative or shares with us the negative environment he was creating for Yitzchak through communication with Yitzchak, Ishmael was mitzachek. You remember that 2 weeks ago, that Vateres Sarah et ben Hagar HaMitzrit, Sarah sees the child of Hagar, Ishmael, mitzachek. He's mitzachek with Yitzchak. What is this mitzachek? So Rashi shares with us that it relates to behavior that is far from moral behavior, and she was concerned. She was extremely concerned about the spiritual impact it's going to have on her son. But Sforno has a different insight. Sforno says, wait a second. Mitzachek, tzchok, mocking. It must be that Ishmael was expressing some idea that came forth from the mockers. What was that idea? Ishmael was turning to Yitzchak and saying to Yitzchak, Yitzchak, you think that Abraham's your father? You really think so? Well, I have some news for you. You're an outsider. You're an outsider. Your real father is Philistine. His name is Avimelech. Now, don't expect him to recognize you. And throughout history, illegitimate children were not recognized. You're stuck here. I'm the real son. Ishmael is saying to Yitzchak, I'm the one that is going to continue with the legacy of Avraham Avinu. You don't belong here. At the right time, I'll figure out a way, to ship you off. But remember, you are not a son of Avraham. Mitzachek. When Sarai hears that, she says, this fellow needs to get out of here. This Ishmael needs to get out of here. And we also always have addressed in the past the fact that the Philistines, according to many commentators, did not really originate from that region. They were Polshim, Paleshet. Philistine comes from the word Paleshet, Polesh. They were invaders who originated from the Greek islands. They were perhaps the first Europeans that set foot in the land of Eretz Israel. And if you put that together, Ishmael is claiming you don't have a right to this land. You do not have the right to that which was promised to Avraham Avinu. You're an outsider, right? You're a colonist. You want to go ahead and come from a European family and claim a land that is mine. That is what Ishmael is saying to Yitzchak. And if Maaseh Avot Siman Lebanim, we could very well understand that the Torah here is hinting to the realities we face obviously in the past century, and unfortunately up until this day, that you have people who are the carriers of the tradition of Ishmael and perhaps even the descendants of Ishmael, who are claiming Israel does not belong to you, it's Palestine. And they'll show you maps of pre-1947, all of Israel was Palestine. And then the Jews took one section, and then in 67, they took another section. The Israelis don't belong there. They are Europeans, right? They are descendants of some European tribe that claim to be children of Abraham, but they're not. They are the mitzachek that we have to address. So suddenly we look at this midrash, or we look at this reading of the text, and we realize, you know what? It actually relates to our challenges that we face today. So that's really a little bit of what we've talked about in the past, but it's always a good reminder that everything can be found in Torah, historical facts, guidance that relates to us. So the story itself obviously continues with Esav and Yaakov coming into this world. And then the big sale, when Yaakov is cooking some kind of lentil dish, he's making a stew. And if the Torah describes what he is cooking, it obviously has to have some significance. And I have no doubt that people would have interest in knowing what was consumed in biblical times. There's actually a bread that seems to be popular by those who seek healthy food called Ezekiel bread. Ezekiel bread. Ezekiel bread is really Ezekiel, I think it's 4:8. It's based on a verse in Ezekiel where Ezekiel is told, listen, you're in Babylonia, but you should feel the pain of the Israelites who are in the land of Israel. So you should make yourself a bread that's of low quality and just a mix of all kind of different grains. And you should even cook it in a way which is very unpleasant. You should use human feces as fuel. So because the bread presents, or because the text in Ezekiel presents a list of ingredients, So it's a beautiful tool for marketing, and therefore you could go to Whole Foods and pray for $9. You could get a frozen loaf of Ezekiel bread, and you feel very, very biblical, even though the context there is one that is quite negative. So obviously, for those who are interested in cooking like the patriarchs, and there most probably is a cookbook somewhere out there called the Biblical Cookbook, but for us who study Torah and understand that these are important messages, we wonder what exactly is the relevance of the dish, okay, of this red dish. So Midrash fills in a few details. Midrash tells us that Yaakov on that day is mourning the loss of his grandfather, Avraham Avinu. And as a result of that, he was cooking a food that was relevant to mourning. And as we know, unfortunately, a Shiva actually begins when people from the outside bring the mourners food. The tradition is that it should be a food that is round, like an egg. So many people have that tradition that the first meal in a Shiva is an egg. And it symbolizes two things. One is it's circular, and it's really a reminder that, you know what, at this point, you are in extreme pain due to the loss, but there's a cycle, right? There's continuity, and things will go around. So perhaps there's a little bit of a comfort that you have, that times are going to pass, just as the annual calendar really is one that is circular. You return next year to the same date, things are going to be different. So too, a little bit of a comfort there. But others say that the idea of eating something round is, since it does not have an opening, it's completely closed, it's a reminder that the mourner keeps his mouth quiet. In other words, perhaps your first feeling when you experience something very overwhelming is to challenge God, or to be like Job and start asking, is there one really running this world? Because look at the pain I'm experiencing at this moment. So as a reminder to keep quiet, you create something that is round. So that explains the tradition of the egg. But another food item that would be teaching those same lessons are the lentils. And therefore, Vayized Yaakov Nezid, right? The rabbis tell us that this was a lentil dish that was red. And Esav comes in, and Esav perhaps is not learning so much the lesson of what is taking place, but he says to Yaakov, can you please pour some down my throat? And here comes the big sale, a very interesting one, where Yaakov says, listen, if you want it, transfer to me the birthright. In other words, the birthright, which indicates responsibility, you seem to be choosing a lifestyle that responsibility is not going to fit with it. Meaning you're out there, you're interested in the sport. He was a hunter. Hunters in the past were ones that were very much entertained by it, but you cannot say that this is a person that focuses on values and on continuity of a specific way of living. So therefore, Yaakov says, listen, your lifestyle doesn't fit with the agenda that our family has to teach, right? To transmit the lesson of God, of righteousness, of spirituality. And Esav responds, you know what? I don't need it. Hinei anochi holech lamut. You know, I'm going to die. What use to me is a birthright? I'm going to die. What does that mean, I'm going to die? So some commentators say, listen, give me a little bit of the guidelines of what are required, right? What's required from one who has the birthright? Well, he perhaps serves in a temple. What are the requirements? When he starts hearing those requirements, he says, this is not for me. I'm going to die from it. Others note that what he really is saying is the following. You know, I'm a hunter. I'm in a dangerous place. I get tremendous thrill, but there's a danger involved. And odds are eventually I'm not going to survive. So due to the fact that eventually I'm not going to survive, what do I need this birthright? And the fundamental message there is, you know, the beginning of a failed Jewish journey is when one does not value life. The most fundamental teaching that has to be the beginning of all Jewish teachings and all teachings of ethics are to value life. I once interacted with someone that shared with me how in the past, for a thrill, he would ride a motorcycle at incredible speeds. You know, once in a while you're on a highway and someone passes you up and you say to yourself, I'm Meshuggah. He's a Meshuggah. Why is he going 160 kilometers an hour, right? Where one small road bump, he's gone. So there are such people. They get a thrill. It seems to be a great thrill of riding on that motorcycle going 180 kilometers an hour, but you're basically not valuing what you are gambling with, your life. And Esav's journey is a very tragic journey because he grew up in a good home, but he fails because simply he does not value his life enough. And therefore he makes that declaration on Nehinei Anochi Olech Lamut. Now, why exactly on that day? There's a fascinating midrash that shares with us the following. The patriarchs were supposed to live until age 180. This is something that appears in several rabbinic sources. Yitzchak reached that age 180, and it appears that there was an understanding that Avraham Avinu is also going to. The day Avraham dies at age 175 was a tragic day, and we deal with tragedy in life. But for Esav, this was overwhelming. It was overwhelming, and he started asking questions. And the Midrash tells us that when Esav heard of the passing of his grandfather, he said, Be'oto hazaken. You know, to think about this old man, this righteous old man, my grandfather. Esav, it appears, had a very close relationship with Avraham. And it's not so far-fetched if you think about it, because when Esav would look at his father, you envision Yitzchak as one that is more at home. He does not focus so much on going out and interacting with the world. Avraham, on the other hand, every single morning rolled up his sleeves, even as an ill man recovering from surgery. His interest was to interact, to meet the world, see people, inspire them. And for someone with a personality like Esav, Avraham was a role model. And therefore, on that day, he's a 15-year-old, a very sensitive time for a teenager. And he finds out that his grandfather is no longer alive. He said, if my grandfather, who was so righteous, lost 5 years due to midat hadin, the attribute of justice, so therefore, there's no reward in this world. He started having questions. And when people start having questions, obviously you have to deal with them. And the tragedy is often that they stop valuing life. You know, that there's a problem that exists in Israel in very devoted families, in the Haredi community, of children that are no longer interested in the path of their parents. No longer interested. Meaning it's a very strict environment that's very, very limited by many of them. There's an expectation that they continue only studying Talmud or only going to a specific type of school. And when kids have different types of personalities, right, and they're more artistic, they're more creative, they're more interested in the world, quite often if you create this very limited path for them, so there's nothing on the outside. So for them, right, to go ahead and leave this limiting environment, it means walking away totally, which is extremely tragic. When on the other hand, we are blessed in North America that we have an understanding that people are different. And if a child is not interested only in Talmudic studies, okay, go ahead, figure out what you enjoy. There is so many wonderful ways to relate to God Almighty with an interest in arts and in science and in law or in medicine. In other words, when you have an orthodoxy that understands that it's so broad, you lose far few than in a world where there's only one path. I have a cousin in Israel. I have a cousin. I remember she got married in '86, married a fellow who went to a little bit more of a liberal yeshiva, but I remember him telling me he would never send his kids to such a more liberal yeshiva that had secular studies. He wanted his kids to be part of the path of righteousness where there's only devoted to Talmud. Well, I know, unfortunately, one of his kids is, quite distant from Judaism. Now, the beautiful story is he's achieving wonderful things. He's a reporter on the Israeli news, an expert on the military. But the idea is that while in North America, a person doing it would have no problem continuing Shmir Shabbos and Kashrus and all those details, if you create a very narrow path for them, what's going to happen? As soon as they don't fit into it, they drop totally. They drop totally. And that's a tragedy that occurs. But believe it or not, there's even a worse tragedy than that. There's a worse tragedy than that. And that is that there are situations where the person, due to the fact that all of their education is based on being like those great rabbis or being like those great educators or being like those great righteous women, and then suddenly they stop valuing themselves. And when you don't value yourself and you can't deal with yourself, you turn to substances that blur things, right? You start a little bit with alcohol, right? Then you could upgrade to all kind of different substances. And the idea of self-value is gone, right? The tragic departure often leads to substances, and unfortunately that exists in Israel as well, that you have people that the value is gone, and the path to return such people, the way to bring them back is step number one is not to talk about Shabbos and not to talk about kashrut. That's not the priority at that point. The priority is for them to value themselves, right? Get off those substances, value what you do. And if you could find meaning in art, so feel good about the art that you are doing. If you find meaning in the fact that you enjoy interacting with the Humane Society and you're good with finding stray dogs, feel good about it. That's step number one. Value what you are doing, value life. Once you value life, then you could start saying, okay, let me bring that religion back into it with an understanding that the religion does not look down at what I am about and who I am. And therefore, on Hinei Anochi Olech Lamut, when the Torah presents the first statement by a person who grew up in that environment that seemed to be leading on to the path of perfection, but left it, the Torah tells us, you know what the problem is? Hinei anochi holech lamut. When you don't value life, that's the greatest tragedy of all, right? To value life. And this is something that obviously, for those of us who are a little bit older, it's a given, but it's our responsibility to be sure that the next generation is aware of it as well. So that's what we have here with this idea. Now, the main focus today is going to relate again to the Philistines, to Avimelech. Okay, we're big into the Philistines, and we know the story of the wells, meaning a well in those days was really a location of where you could have civilization. When you write a bill of divorce, a get, there are many specifics that the halacha requires, many specifics. And among them, they want the document to state with clarity who the person is, who the former wife is, and where they live. It is very, very important to have the name of the city. And when they would mention cities, they wanted to be sure that these were not confused with another city that has perhaps the same name. So they also would write the source of water of the city. Meaning, Toronto, they would write that the city of Toronto, and that city is located on Lake Ontario and the Don River and the Humber River, for example. It was very important to know the sources of water. So the idea was that if there's another Toronto somewhere, you won't confuse it because it's probably not on Lake Ontario, Don River, and the Humber River. So water brought a society together. And for the patriarchs, for Avraham, and then for Yitzchak, who had an agenda to create communities of value, of righteousness, of morality, of appreciation, they had to start off with a well. And therefore, wells played a very significant role for the patriarchs. And it also symbolizes Torah. Because when they built that well, their goal was not just to provide for people physically. Their goal was that as a result of this well, they could bring people together and inspire them about their spiritual responsibilities. Fine. So the Philistines, on the other hand, were uncomfortable with it for two reasons. Number one, it indicated control. When you go ahead and have a well and you own it, it's a region that you control. They're going to turn to Avraham Avinu for guidance. They're going to turn to Yitzchak for guidance. It was political control. And obviously, Philistines who are invaders, they want to expand their control. That's number one. And number two, the Philistines were not happy with the ideals that were being taught by those wells. So to go ahead and seal wells, it is not just to seal a well. It is not just to end life there, but to end an idea, to end the influence of Avraham Avinu. And therefore, the Torah describes this in great detail, because this is important, because we as Jews have an agenda, yes, to build wells. We have an agenda. Our Judaism is about influence. Not actively, we're not running out there to Times Square with a big sign that if you don't, keep Shabbos, you won't go to Gan Eden. And I mention that because there are people with big signs that say if you don't believe in JC, you're in trouble, right? I remember walking once with the kids in Times Square, and there was a person with such a sign, and it was smack in front of me, and I'm reading it. And there was a person there next to me who just burst out laughing because he thought it was interesting that there's a Jewish fellow with the kippah reading the sign about JC and what's going to happen to me if I don't believe in him. And I don't, okay? So we did it through actions. Avraham Avinu inspired people. And the wells are very important. And therefore, the Torah describes even the names of the wells, right? Because we are told, for example, that Yitzchak goes ahead and digs one well, and it was named Esek, and he digs another well, it was called Sitna, and then he digs another one, he goes ahead and creates the third one, and it's called Rechovot. These names, as we'll see soon, have significance. But what we're going to go ahead and analyze is how after the fighting with this king of the Philistines, we read 2 weeks ago about the king of the Philistines coming to Abraham and say, you know what, let's make a treaty. Like there was a desire for a treaty. And so too with Yitzchak, eventually after fighting him, they realized, you know what, this is a man of God. We're not going to beat him. And therefore, let's work out some kind of treaty, because if you realize that someone is here to stay, you have to work with them. Okay, so what we're going to do is we're going to compare the two very, very soon. But before we get to it, you have to remember the following as you read the text. We are going to be talking about 7 wells. 7 wells. Okay. Yitzchak is familiar with the fact that there were 3 wells that his father dug that were unfortunately filled with earth. Yitzchak goes ahead, gets his staff and gets his workers to go ahead and bring life back to them, digs them again. Then he adds 3 additional ones. So there's 1, 2, 3, and then there's 4, 5, 6. 4, 5, 6 are given names. Ose, Esek, Sitna, and Rechovot, which we've talked in the past, they symbolize the temple, different discussion. And then there's well number 7, that when everything is settled, finally, well number 7 is called Be'er Sheva, okay? So keep that information in mind. But what you also will remember is that Be'er Sheva is already mentioned 2 weeks ago when Avraham is interacting with the same king, or perhaps it was his son that had the same name, but we'll assume it's the same king. And we are told that they call the place Be'er Sheva, and it is called Be'er Sheva because they took an oath there. Meaning, where Avimelech turns to Avraham and says, listen here, let's take an oath, let's create this covenant. And Avraham says, fine, and Avraham gives him several gifts. So we are told, Al ken kara lamakom ha'u Be'er Sheva. Why did they call it Be'er Sheva? Not because of the number 7, but 2 weeks ago it was because Kisham nishbe'u shnehem. It was because of an oath. So that's the question I'm going to ask you when you are driving ever in Israel, or if you land up in Be'er Sheva. I was there once, perhaps twice. When you come to Be'er Sheva and you look at the name, what are you going to be thinking about? Are you going to be thinking about Be'er Sheva as Shvu'ah, as oath? And you're going to be thinking about the name that was given by Abraham due to an oath he made with the king of the Philistines? Or perhaps you're going to go with Be'er Sheva, which, as the Sforno tells us, it is because it relates to number 7. And when you look at it and you see that city, you're going to be meditating, boy, you have some difficult people in the neighborhood, because you had to deal with every single brought forth issues until well number 7. So which name are you going to be working with? Okay, that's the question I'm asking. Which name are you going to be thinking when you travel to Be'er Sheva? So, when people study Chumash, or people give it Dvar Torah and Chumash, quite often they are addressing a contemporary issue, right? They look at the contemporary world, they find an issue that needs to be addressed. They're going to turn to the text and find in the text something that relates to the issue they are addressing today, and say that just as Abraham did, ABC, we should be doing it today as well. And sometimes you could find people from different schools, from different approaches to Judaism, reading into the text very, very differently. So today I would like to share with you an insight by a rabbi, a very well-respected rabbi. And he is a very religious individual. He is one of the leaders of the religious Zionist movement in Israel, a big Talmid Chacham. He writes beautifully. He writes beautifully on Chumash. He writes beautifully on Halacha. And I enjoy his writings very, very much so. His name is Harav Yaakov Ariel. I think Chief Rabbi of Ramat Gan, if I'm not mistaken. He was a candidate to be the chief rabbi in 2003. Unfortunately, he lost to someone that is far less qualified than he was on many, many levels. But Rabbi Yaakov Ariel is a beautiful, beautiful person to read. But obviously, you're going to be hearing an insight and the way he is going to read this parsha that comes forth from a way of looking at the world or the politics of the Middle East from a very specific perspective. And he says the following, if you look carefully at how Avraham dealt with someone that wants to create some kind of peace treaty, and the way Yitzchak dealt with someone that wants to create some kind of peace treaty, it is extremely different, extremely different. And you have to understand that they were very, very different personalities. Abraham and Yitzchak, very, very different. Avraham, as mentioned, is a people person. And he sees, when he interacts with another person, he naturally feels a connection. Due to the fact that he is devoted to the higher being, just as a giver wants to give another person a nice cup of coffee, a nice person who is spiritual wants to give spirituality to another person, right? Sometimes you interact with people that they feel that they have to comment that your tefillin are not precise or your mezuzah is not precise. Often it comes from a good place. They are givers, not always, but often. They're givers, just as they would want to give you breakfast if you are hungry. They want to give you spiritual advice. Now you have to have seichel too, which is hard to find. But the idea is Avraham is a people person. Now, when the people person, Avraham Avinu, is interacting with an Avimelech that comes over to him, and remember, this is an Avimelech that his team Avimelech, the Philistines, just sealed up wells of Avraham. So he's dealing here with a very difficult kingdom, a very difficult tribe or group. And when Avraham is approached by them, so Avraham starts off with giving him rebuke. Now, by the way, rebuke in Judaism, when done correctly, is the byproduct of a relationship. In Judaism, if I don't like you, or if you don't like me, we shouldn't be giving rebuke to one another. That's not rebuke, that's hatred. Pure rebuke is when I feel a connection and I love that person. And I feel that just as they shouldn't be drinking bleach, they shouldn't be drinking something that has clam juice in it. So then I tell them, it's better if you don't drink it. Rebuke is the byproduct of a close relationship. It's not rebuke if you don't like them. It's worthless, right? So therefore, when Avraham meets Avimelech, he starts off by, and this is in Parashat Vayera, chapter 21, verse 25, Vehochiach Avraham et Avimelech. He rebukes him. Now, how does Avimelech respond? So remember, this is the Middle East. In the Middle East, you could do something quite incredible. You could claim one thing in public in one language and say something else in a different language that is totally different. You could do that in the Middle East. You could get up in English, right, and get on the BBC and CNN and say, we want peace with the Israelis, right? We are people of peace. We're willing to go back to the borders of 1967, and then everything will be fine. And then in Arabic, you could get up and say that you shaheeds should continue with the battle of blowing up Jews. That's something that could be done in the Middle East. And then when CNN, perhaps, probably not, asks you, wait a second, we have something that you said in Arabic, I don't know. And that's how things work in the Middle East. And Avimelech, after being rebuked, you know what he says? Lo yadati mi asa et hadavar hazeh. Are you serious? You're telling me that within my camp, there is someone that is sealing wells? I didn't know about it. I really didn't know about it. But then he decides to start blaming Avraham. That's what they do, blame the Jews. Oh, we have extremists among us. Well, that is because the Jews are to blame. Vegamata lo higaretali. You didn't inform me. So this is a little bit of who Avraham is dealing with. But this is Avraham. Avraham is an idealist. He has an ideal. The ideal is that humanity comes together, and even after realizing he's not a naive individual, but he still has that deep desire to trust the other human. And what does he do? He starts giving gifts. Son, bakar, a lot of animals. These are very precious gifts, by the way, that he gives them. Okay? Now, if there is a covenant, you would expect that gifts would be returned as well. But sometimes it appears in the Middle East that you have to give things and get nothing in return. That's how it works. He gets nothing. But again, Avraham Avinu is an idealist. He takes an oath. Nishba'u shnehem. Number one, they take an oath. And number two, vayichretu brit. It's not just an oath. An oath means I'm not going to harm you, right? So help me God, I'm not going to harm you. A brit is a covenant. A covenant where somehow parties together. Avraham Avinu even establishes a peace treaty, a brit, Be'er Sheva. And this was so significant for Avraham Avinu that the name of that location is a well where there was an oath, where we came together, we and the Philistines, we and our neighbors in the chosen land. We have a shua, there's an oath. That's how Avraham Avinu does it, because he has this ideal where humanity needs to go. However, points out Rabbi Ariel, when it comes to Yitzchak is very, very differently, works very, very differently. He is a realist. He knows who he's dealing with. And his avodas Hashem is not focusing so much on connecting with people, but more with ideals. And therefore, when a group of individuals come who caused harm, he's not going to go ahead and ignore their behavior. And therefore, he comes, when eventually they come to him, there's a long story. They cause him a lot of tzoros. These Philistines, Avimelech caused tzoros to Yitzchak, right? That he has to put all his energy on dealing with wells, on water resources, on being kicked out. He was kicked out during a year of famine. They're jealous of him because God Almighty blessed him. Yitzchak is having great difficulty. Eventually, they come to him. They recognize. Now, when they come to Avraham Avinu, Avraham feels immediately a connection. He feels a connection, and as a result, he says, listen, you did something wrong, but let's work it out. A shvuah, even a brit. When they come to Yitzchak, Yitzchak opens his mouth, and you know what he says? So this is in our Parashat Toldot, chapter 26, verse 27. Vayomar aleim Yitzchak, madua batem elai. What are you here for? Why did you come? Vatem snetem oti. You hate me. You sent me away. Like, what are you here for? What are you here for? Now, he knew that they're going to want to negotiate something. But Yitzchak's, by the way, a brilliant negotiator. They say that if you ever buy a used car and they offer you and they show you a specific car, the first thing you're supposed to do is complain about the color and say, blue, I hate blue. Okay, I'll look at it if you want. Because what you are doing basically is they realize that they don't have you, and therefore they're going to have to go ahead and lower the price to convince you to drive away in a blue car, right? So that's Yitzchak. Madua batem elai. You guys don't hate me. You guys hate me. And then they say, listen, we saw that God's with you. We have no choice. You can't mess with these, with the righteous Jew. So Yitzchak is a mensch, by the way. He gives them food. A mensch he is. But he doesn't commit to anything at night. He if you look carefully in the text, he makes no covenant, no shvuah, no brit. He feeds them, and then he says you could take a nap, and next morning, only next morning, does he take an oath. And the oath is basically, I'm not going to harm you. But guess what? There is no brit. Brit, right? A covenant? No way. Yitzchak knows who he is dealing with. He doesn't feel that deep desire to connect. And therefore, recognizing that these peace treaties of his father, that the father gave and gave and gave and walked away with nothing because one generation later, garnish mit garnish, these treaties are worthless. Words are worthless in the Middle East. Yitzchak understands that. And therefore, yes, he's going to take an oath not to harm because he never has a desire to harm. But there is not one word, not one reference to a brit. Forget about a brit with such people. And in addition, when it comes time to naming the city, Vaikru oto shvuah, it is only after the servants of Yitzchak come and inform him. Guess what? We have a new well. It's well number 7. And he says, aha, well number 7. So from now on, when we look at Be'er Sheva, it has nothing to do with an oath. Those things don't carry water. You look at the number. This is the 7th well, a reminder of the journey that he had to go through with the other wells. So Vaikra oto Shiva al ken shema'ir Be'er Sheva. It is Be'er Sheva, and we're going to call it Be'er Sheva ad hayom hazeh, not because of an oath with someone that you can trust, but rather because it is the 7th one. Let us remember, right? Let us remember the difficult journey we had with these neighbors in the region. So this is what Rav Ariel says. Now, relating to the fact that we view Avimelech as the Europeans in the neighborhood, so it's just something that struck me that a few days ago, one of the chief negotiators of the Palestinians, Saib Erkat, died. He died. So obviously, you have within Israel people like Tzipi Livni, who had to go to the international media and say, yes, he was a person, a negotiator, and he wanted to go ahead and work something out. And obviously the world media loves hearing that there was, a nice Palestinian who really, really wanted to work things out. And there could have been peace. If not for people like Netanyahu and Trump, everything would have worked out because the Palestinians have leaders like Saeb Erekat, right? Now, the BBC, I read this, that the BBC was going to interview a Chavrat Knesset, I think she was even born in Toronto, by the name of Haskel. And this Chavrat Knesset, she's a younger Chavrat Knesset, not part of the extreme right wing, but rather a mainstream Likud Chavrat Knesset, was going to be interviewed with the BBC. And before they interview her, she shared that, by the way, I'm planning to say that Saeb Erekat was no righteous and he was no saint. Because yes, in English, he said everything right. He said everything right. But if you listen to what he said in Arabic and the type of people he visited and the type of people he interacted with and what he encouraged, he was no different than the other terrorists, than Yasser Arafat. The BBC, after hearing what she is planning to say, they basically said to her, no, thank you. And they cut her off. They don't want to hear that, right? The Europeans don't want to hear the truth. What do they want? They want the naive. They want, I'm not going to say Chas v'Shalom an Avram Avinu Jew, because he was not naive. Avram Avinu was teaching an ideal. But what we have to take in this generation is the understanding of Yitzchak. Know who you are dealing with, right? Remember the history. Look at Beer Sheva, not as a city of like, oh, what a beautiful city. You make an oath and you make a covenant with your neighbors and everything will be okay. Don't look at Beer Sheva like that. Look at Beer Sheva with an understanding that the journey is long. The journey is long. Look what we had to go through with, right? And the numbers in Aleinu, right, of the bombings that were occurring 18, 20 years ago. You look at that journey, that's what you think about Beer Sheva, the difficulty we had to go through because of people with a vision that ignored reality. This is what Rav Ariel says. And I think you understand very well where Rav Ariel is coming from. No question about that. But for me, it's a fascinating insight of how to look at the text and how to look at the psukim. And I hope you were able to appreciate it well. And I hope also that one day we merit to be near Beer Sheva and to think of all these interesting ideas that this great rabbi shares with us. Okay, so now let's look a little bit at some comments. David Wolf says, eating the Bible, over 15 delicious recipes to feed your body and nourish your soul. Available on Amazon. Okay, so that related to the foods of biblical foods that we talked about.
There are many others also, but most of them were written by Christians as to how to eat like JC.
Eat like JC, very nice.
This one was actually written by an Israeli.
A from lady.
Okay. We are mourning for our cut. What was that? We hope to also mourn. Oh, okay.
What?
All right, okay. There's a lot of interesting comments here that relates to Saeb Erekat, but for now I'm going to stop the recording. Thank you for listening. Those who are listening on YouTube.